Hello and welcome to Abbott Media. I'm Grant Abbott, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made this house model set for the game Atlas Empires. This version's a time-lapse version with me talking over the top. There is a more detailed version if you want to know how to make the sort of canvas tent, and I'll put a link in the description. So I've jumped ahead a fair bit here, and I'm modelling a chimney for one of the houses, and this is sort of level 6 or 7 or something like that. But you can see the techniques that I'm using. Basically it's all sort of box modelling and adapting, sometimes putting bevels in, and then just placing items on top of each other. So it's fine to have overlapping geometry quite a lot of the time. You actually want to do that. I know it's sort of one of those big no-nos when you're modelling, but generally speaking, for low poly work, if it's simpler to overlap a model or shape one on top of the other, then you do it. A lot of the time you can save texture space doing that, and it can be a lot lower poly with the finished result. So I'm just placing these sort of stones into place. It's quite fun really, just shifting them about, and you can see they're not full stones, they're just sort of like a cap that's placed on the top. And you kind of have to think of it a bit like miniature modelling. You wouldn't build a whole block and then place it into the wall. You'd build the sort of outside and stick it on. So that's the sort of same technique I'm using here. I'm trying to cut down areas that I don't need as well, which does increase the polys, but more important is my texture space for this, because I've only got a 512 texture for the whole set, so I have to repeat myself, and I've used a lot of mirroring in places. Trying to match the concept art as closely as possible. It's quite nice having a piece of concept art. You don't really have to think too much then, you're just trying to match up everything and you sort of just plod along copying. But every now and again I have to give it some thought as to whether the concept art is going to work, whether I need to adapt it really slightly in order to make it work easier for the shape and for the painting. Now the base is mirrored, so I'm placing those bricks and stones so they sort of break up the mirror slightly. For a lot of these shapes there's a lot of mirroring going on, and it can be a touch awkward when you're painting because you know it's going to mirror across the other side, so you have to be really careful with highlights that you put in and that sort of thing. You can see the sort of technique I'm using a lot here with the horn. I'm using a lot of proportional editing and loop cuts and bevels and things like that. So nothing too complicated really. The complicated part is more the texture painting. I'm using really basic techniques as well. I'm sure there's probably modifiers here and there that I could put in and use, but sometimes it's just quicker to just model something and place it in. I could probably use snapping a bit more as well, but even turning snapping on and off, sometimes you just better off moving the shape into position yourself by eye and then just lining it up with the different viewports. You can see I'm copying and pasting wherever possible, so there I just copied a piece from a previous part of the set. And they're all linked duplicates, so it's really easy to model like that. You just link them up, and then once you start painting, it will paint on the same UV map, and therefore you only need to paint one. The only problem with that is that you struggle to do any shading, because you can't shade certain parts if you're not going to have that sort of ambient occlusion between two objects. So for that eaves, for example, that's sitting slightly differently in a different part of the model, so I can't put shading around the outside very easily. It's always tricky when doing something like that banner there, whether I need the back of the banner or not. I kept it in this time because the viewer might be able to see it, but it's unlikely they would, and it's a lot of texture space to use. What I should have done is used a mirror, but I actually forgot to do that in this case, and didn't really think too much about it until I started texture painting later, and by that time I'd texture painted everything else, and the UVs were kind of set. So you really have to think ahead quite a lot into what you're going to be doing. So this is the painting process now. You can see that I've already painted the first tent, and there's a detailed tutorial on that, as I've said. And matching up the colours is quite tricky. I was using the colour overlay quite a lot, but even when you're using the colour picker with the colour overlay, you're only picking a pixel, and the pixels can be quite different to the actual colour outcome, unless you have a really block colour, but I tend to have a more sort of painter, artistic approach of blending colours together and things. So I spent a lot of time on the top of the canvas here, because the top of the models are probably going to be seen a fair bit really. I'm imagining we're going to have sort of a bird's eye type of view looking over these models. It's good to jump into isolation mode with / on your numpad and to sort of separate it to paint on it, but you do want to see how it's going to sit as well within your model, so I jump in and out of isolation mode quite often. You can see that I'm shading the outside of these wooden planks here, and that's fine because I know that module is going to be in the same position butted up against these sort of big logs here. But for something like a support beam that's used several times over and over, I can't add that sort of shading in. Generally speaking, when you're painting, you're shading the bottom part a bit more than the top, so the bottom part is darker, the top bit is lighter. I use the screen and multiply brushes an awful lot. It's the easiest way, but generally the bottom part is darker because that doesn't hit the light so much and the sun comes from the top, so the top part of your model is lighter. And it's just a general rule of thumb when you're texture painting like this. You don't really paint in shadows except sort of 12 o'clock shadows, in the sense that the sun's right above you. That way, if the environment changes at all, and let's say the character had a lamp or torch or something, it wouldn't affect it too much when they're walking past a model. So you can see the effects of my mirror a lot here as well, when I'm painting these sort of circular tops. As I've said, the screen and multiply brush are my main tools, and it's just a simple case of shading and highlighting parts. Very rarely I go across to the actual UV texture paint area and paint on the UVs. It's sometimes easier. You can see for that sort of cross design, it's a bit easier. Especially as the texture painting tools in Blender are a touch limited. It doesn't follow the normals of your shape. So if you paint across something that's curved, it will paint just a line across the top and sometimes not hit the edges. And that's a real limitation. I hope they do sort that out soon. And I think other programs are better for that. The other problem that most people will point out is layering. It's quite hard to get layering to work within Blender. Well, it's not hard, but it just takes time to set up and it's a complex process. This sort of stone texture that I'm painting at the moment, keeping it fairly simple. I don't add too many details because I've mirrored it for the sake of saving texture space. So if it's mirrored, then your detail will just be copied across to the other side, or in some cases 4 times because I've mirrored it in both the Y and X axis. So I am a little bit careful of those sort of things. Now here you can see I forgot to put a bit of my model in, and that's why it's kind of handy to have a tiny bit of spare texture space in case you accidentally do something like that and you need to model an extra bit, because then you've got to find some UV space for it. Usually it's something that's fairly hidden because you don't notice it and you just quickly have to model it in, so you can probably squish that texture right down and not worry too much about it. Your UV maps don't all have to be the same size. If one bit isn't as important as another bit, you can scale that down in your UV map area. Generally speaking, I've kept them all to sort of medium size and not worried too much about that. I was having a good look at the concept art here, because the concept art I really like and I think it's absolutely fantastic, but it wasn't particularly detailed on this bit, and it wasn't quite clear exactly what it was, because I've only got one angle to look at these objects from. So I just sort of gave it a bit of a shine and made it look like the concept art. So you can see here that this is mirrored in the X and Y axis, so I have to be very careful of the detail so it doesn't look really obvious that it's mirrored. And speed is quite important here as well. They need these models quite quickly, and in the game development world, time is money, of course. So I've got to try and get through these as quickly as possible, so add the right amount of detail. There's so much more detail I could add, but remember, I've only got a small texture space. And you have to consider how far away people are going to be from the model itself. So do you really need all that detail is a question you need to ask yourself. I always find metal a really tough one to paint. You need much smaller highlights, but you also need to give it this idea that it's reflecting. And that's really tough because you have to sort of paint in some sort of environment and blur it in the background. It's a bit of a tough one for hand painting. The main thing is with metal that your highlights are very small though, and very bright as well. I always follow the same technique with wood. It's very simplistic. Highlight the outsides, smudge across some lines with different brown colours. A bit reddy as well. I like to go reddy orangey. I think that gives it that sort of Disney feel that I quite like. And World of Warcraft, Clash of Clans, that sort of thing. I do have a huge amount of reference images as well. And my PureRef file just keeps getting bigger and bigger as I see things and think, oh, that would be helpful for me to have that in mind when I'm painting this bit and this bit. When I'm painting the light windows, I have to think about adding some sort of glow, so I actually paint a bit of yellow onto the surrounding areas as well to look like they're glowing really slightly. When you're painting stone and wood and things like that, and they're quite angular, you just make sure you go around the edges with a highlight. It's fairly simplistic really and fairly straightforward, but you kind of get used to what works and what doesn't after a fair bit of practice. Again, you'll see the effects of the mirror here, that I only have to paint 1/4 of these circular shapes. But you do have to be careful with the highlights and things, or adding any detail in. Whenever I'm doing my shapes, my circular shapes or cylindrical shapes, I'm always thinking about whether it can cut up into 4. So when you're adding cylinder vertices, or the vertices count, you think in terms of multiples of 4. So I think all these have 12. Yeah, I think it's 12. So I had to think about that when I was painting on the silver blobs. But you don't really want it across one of the edges. It can sort of distort slightly. But I think I had to in this case anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. Now you can see I'm painting the wall here. Now this is kind of interesting because you can see the effects that not being able to paint on the normal has. You'll see areas that are sort of lighter and darker as they didn't get hit by the brush when I was painting. But that's not actually a problem, that adds a bit of shading, so it's kind of helpful in a weird way, but it's not always advantageous. I've kept the BSDF shader here because I wanted to have a bit of shading in the viewport, and then I turn it off sort of just here, I think it is, yes. And that's to enable me to see where the lines are when I'm creating the outlines of the shapes, and the bits that are sort of the stones that are sort of stuck on the outside. I can then sort of paint the edges of those without too much fuss, because I can actually see the edges. But when you turn the BSDF shader off and go to an emission, then you can't see any of that shading. It's just like it's smooth shading, and it's really awkward to see the shape and the edges. So I cut between the BSDF shader and an emission shader. The emission shader is the one that will be the final output, because that's without any shading at all, and you're using your painting for the shading. But when you've got the BSDF, you see a bit of the lighting, and therefore you can see the edges of your shapes. Hopefully that makes sense. It's quite nice, the modular approach, because you end up painting one piece and then it just sort of fills in everywhere else. And then quite quickly it builds up and you've just suddenly got a complete set. It's quite a nice feeling. The difficulty I'm occasionally having is that sometimes I add a bit of shading in for objects where they're allowed it because they don't overlap, or I haven't used them in a different location in a different place. But then the other ones look quite flat, and they're quite difficult to distinguish between the two because I'm not allowed to put any sort of ambient occlusion in there or paint any in. So it can be quite a tough balance. So I only put a small amount of shading in. I'd much rather do a lot more, really, if I were using a full map for each individual object, which I think I'd prefer. But because it's a mobile game, you have to be really careful with your textures. It seems to be the case that you can get away with more polygons, but not so much with textures. I suppose the file sizes don't increase much with polygons or faces that you use, because they're just sort of geometric points. But the texture sizes are really important. You can't get away from them being quite big file sizes. So I'm assuming this download of the game has to be within 50 megabytes or something like that. I don't know whether they've still got that limit, but it used to be that it was 50 megabytes that you can have for sort of mobile games and things like that. So everything, all the programming and all the files have to fit within that size. If that's still the case, I'm not sure that is though. Someone can tell me in the comments if you've even got this far with the video. I am really enjoying this process. I feel like I'm learning a lot whilst doing it. It's nice to practice these techniques and have a good excuse to keep painting and painting and painting. And I'm having to repeat myself loads with wood and stone and all these sort of things. And hopefully I'm getting better as I go along as well. I might have to revisit some of the earlier ones that I do in case they haven't got the same sort of style and that I've sort of adapted. As you naturally do when you go along and you paint something over and over again, you sort of get a bit better at it. So hopefully they'll all sort of match up. I really do like the style of this concept art. It was really great fun. I was really excited when they asked me to join in with this game and to paint these assets, because they're such good fun. There's a style here, sort of. There's old strategy games that have this sort of style as well, where you're sort of building up these blocks of assets and things. But I just really love this that fantasy feeling that these assets have. It's great fun. It's quite rare that I have an object that shares two different, completely different textures. So there's metal in one bit of this and I suppose ivory in the other. And that can be a little bit tricky because you have to sort of smear them and you can isolate faces. But when you're isolating faces when painting, you have to sort of smear them out because it does create a very rigid look. And you can sort of see that I've done that there. So nearing the end stages here, it's useful to just sort of go around and check that I haven't missed anything, have a look at the texture map, make sure you saved your texture map. There's lots of different things like that you need to remember. I'm saving really regularly all the time and sort of just saving the file, adding one to it, saving a copy sort of thing. And it's really important to do that really regularly, especially when you've got a big project like this and time's of the essence. I would have actually liked to have painted a design onto this banner, but again, it's time sort of eluding me here, and it's not in the concept art, so I'm assuming they're not going to be seen from that close up. And we haven't really got that many pixels to paint details such as that, but it would have been quite fun. Cloth is quite an interesting one to paint. You just sort of get these folds, especially with something like a banner. It's just subtle folds and light and dark bits. But it's quite fun to do. Anyway, so that's it. Hopefully you're getting something from all this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.